rolling in the class. Bring your fellowship out there, and y'all can hang out in here. And we will give everyone a minute to get situated. I know people like to fellowship, and so do I, and usually I have to try to rush in here because I want to chat with everybody, and it doesn't quite work always out that way. Big thanks to Vicky for helping us out with getting this looking good, by the way. What? Probably. Hey, that's what we're going to do. Well, it's helpful. It'll be helpful when I'm rebuilding entirely new things. So that'll be, because many of you guys might not know this, I used to use one really big screen with all my bullet points, and be able to do a lot more points on one slide, and now I have smaller screens that are wider, and makes it fun for formatting because I don't get to test it at home. All right. So we're going to get moving. So many of you guys might be aware, I'm going to do, how many of you guys were not here last week? Not here, okay, not here. Anyone else here not here last week? Hey, Anthony, what's up? Okay. Also, are we recording this? Is it being recorded for online? You are recording it. Perfect. Okay. Just want to double check before I get moving. So I'm just going to quickly do a review then, since most everyone was here, but I do want to catch you all up to speed. Okay? So last week we looked at the historical claims and the tests. Now, we talked about how there were actually a significant number of historical texts in comparison with the New Testament to other ancient texts. Many of you guys might remember that there's over like 5,400 Greek manuscripts alone. Most other people that we've looked at is around maybe 12. You're lucky if you have 2. So Plato, all these people, you only have a couple sources. Ours are also the closest. The New Testament is the closest to the event that it claims, which is namely the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it is within 25 to 35 years that these were written, which is actually pretty impressive because most other things, even things like Alexander the Great, were recorded even 100 plus years after the event. So it's a really big deal that ours is so close, and we have so many that exploded across the entire ancient empire. We also talked about how Diocletian, the Roman emperor, tried to actually destroy Christianity by destroying all the manuscripts, and he was obviously unsuccessful. But not only that, even to this day, we have over altogether with Latin and Coptic texts and all the texts of the Bible, we have over 54,000 different manuscripts, which is insane. So, especially with how much hostility it had, right? Especially Christianity's hostility that it received. So what we've done is we've gone over the tests that various historians have used over time to verify whether something's historical, which is why next week we're wrapping up our early testimony series, and next week I'm going to do a core facts presentation on how we know Jesus Christ rose from the dead from a historical angle, okay? So I think that'll be really useful on Palm Sunday. However, when we're talking about how we can verify something, we need to understand that there is a historical way that we find it reliable. Namely, there are 7 historical tests. We reviewed these last week, but I will go ahead and move through. Do we have an early testimony? Generally, the earlier the copies, the more accurate they are, right? Because it's closest to the event. If you had something that was written the day after versus 100 years, you'd probably prefer the day after account, right? That makes sense. And we do know through this that we have texts from 25 to 35 years before, and then also we have a creed, namely written by Paul in Corinthians, that actually is written before that, most likely just a couple years after Christ's resurrection. So do we have an eyewitness testimony? That was the first part of this New Testament series. We definitely have many people who claim to be eyewitness testimonies, correct? And we all see that many of them even were willing to die for their claim of being an eyewitness. So this generally is the best means, right? We normally want eyewitness testimony. I kind of made the joke that there's a reason why whenever an event takes place, we ask, is there eyewitness, right? So that's usually what we want. Then we have multiple independent eyewitness sources. So do we have multiple independent sources? Yes. Do we have multiple independent eyewitness sources? Also yes. So this is how we can confirm and know that something is not fiction. Also, are the eyewitness testimonies trustworthy? Because character matters, right? If you hear, that's actually one of the biggest things, right? Whoa, did that just cut out? I feel like that cut out a little bit. Okay. One of the biggest things that people are looking at when someone's giving their testimony is this person a frequent liar? Are they a deceiver? Do they have other motives? So that is actually a big deal as well. And we actually see that they do have good character, and they were willing to even embarrass themselves by giving details that were embarrassing. So do we have corroborating evidence? Do we have corroborating evidence from archaeology and writers? Absolutely. And one of the big things is Christianity exploding, claims being made, and claims not being refuted, right? We have this explosion of Christianity, which people can't really account for. Was it a cult? Maybe you could go that direction, but what's the point of it? Usually cults are for control, power, things like that. Well, they didn't gain any. They actually gained persecution, and usually the Jews that would convert would be cast out of their little social groups. Gentiles were looked at as weird. You get the idea. There was really no reason for it. So do we have enemy attestation? Because if an opponent admits certain traits of those involved, it confirms even more historicity. And remember, there were people who were not Christian who claimed that Jesus was a good and moral person. So we have historical claims of that, Josephus being one of them. And does the testimony contain embarrassing details about the authors? Many will embellish stories and make themselves look better than they are. So any bad information about the author is probably true. And I always find it funny because, guys, remember Peter? There's a lot of embarrassing details about Peter. How many of you, actually, let me ask, how many of you guys relate with Peter the most? Or is that just me? Okay, all right, my people. Come on, Lord. I'm the guy who would be the dumb guy who would talk back to the Messiah. Who am I anyway? So, in most cases, documents that meet most or all of these historical tests are considered trustworthy beyond all reasonable doubt. And the Bible, or at least the New Testament, fits all those categories in one way or the other. Now, people can, they can say this or that, but regardless, we have good reason. So now I wanted to take time to just address skeptical questions that are asked, okay? So let's address the skeptic. How many of you guys are naturally skeptical? I am literally the guy that almost every single time a story comes out, I go, is it though? I want to wait till more information comes out. And then, so I am a very skeptical person. When somebody tells me this is what the Jews used to do, I still go, I'll look that up. And this is what this word means, really, okay. I do, because, I don't know if it's just because I'm a cynic, which I am cynical. I'm not sure if you guys have picked up on that. I definitely have a cynical side. But the other part is I know that I have been lied to many times or misled by people. So I just want to make sure we're good. So if you're a skeptical person, that's okay. But being a skeptic, you'll find, doesn't make you necessarily smart. So addressing the skeptic, one of the things that people will say is history cannot be known. Yeah, I addressed this a little bit last week, but I'm doing a quick review. The great irony, though, is this usually comes from people who know that you evolved from a single-cell organism. I still find that fun. We can't know history, but we know there is no God, and we know that we evolved. Oh, is that a historical claim? Just wondering. All right, so we can and do know history. For example, you guys already know when Pearl Harbor happened, when the Constitution was signed. So if history cannot be known, no jury could ever reach a verdict. which means justice can never be doled out. If history cannot be known, no one can claim Christianity is false. And if history cannot be known, we cannot know anything, right? Because all the books you read are something done in history. It's a very postmodern idea, because in postmodernism, there's this claim of subjectivism, that everything's subjective, nothing is true. Some of my younger generation might remember the games Assassin's Creed. And the Assassin's Creed is literally nothing is true, everything is permitted. And it always, when I'd play the game, even as a teenager, I'm like, that doesn't make sense. Because if nothing is true and everything is permitted, is it true that everything is permitted? Like, I don't, self-defeating statements are fun. All right, so being a skeptic doesn't make you smart, but it makes someone a questioner, never satisfied with an answer. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to wonder. But when you get answers, you should accept the answers. You shouldn't just resist for the sake of being a skeptic and a cynic, okay? So, the New Testament contains miracles, right? This does not make it illegitimate. If God is real, then miracles are certainly possible. In fact, remember the book of Luke, if you guys go way back, and they're all posted online on our church website if you want to get caught up, we went over all the historical claims of Acts. Remember, we only went through like 16 of hundreds of this, actually it was like 98 historical claims or something like that of the second half of Acts. Not even the full thing. And Acts also contains miracles, which has led many people to go, this is so historically accurate, I have no reason to deny the miracle claims too, because that would be silly, especially if there's good reason to believe that God is real. If there's no good reason to believe God is real, I understand. But there is good reason, and we've covered arguments for God's existence in the past. So the New Testament writers were biased. How many of you guys have heard that? Yeah, all right. Raise your hand today real quick. Don't read ahead. Raise your hand real quick if you're not biased. Come on. I hate that claim. I hate it when people are like, well, it's coming from a biased angle. I'm like, everyone's got a bias. This whole idea of objectivism, that I can be completely unbiased, is usually a lie. Usually we have a bias. It's okay to have a bias, as long as, by the way, your bias is true, right? I am biased toward truth claims. That's my bias. I don't want to believe false claims. So yes, they were converted and biased, but this doesn't mean that they were lying or exaggerating. If you witness such things, you would probably be biased too, right? Like, I saw Jesus rose from the dead. All right, well, deny it. No. Well, you're just biased. Okay. We all ought to be biased toward truth, guys. We all ought to be, which is why every time something comes up, it's okay to go, is that true? And look it up, okay? It's okay. Doesn't make you a conspiracy theorist either. It just means that you want to try to find truth. Of course, have you ever noticed that every conspiracy was once a conspiracy theory before it came out as true? Fun fact. Anyway, they wanted to gain power. This is another thing people will say, but this is simply false. I already talked about this a second ago. They got the exact opposite. They got submission, persecution, torture, ridicule, and death. And let's be honest, guys, Paul gave up tons of power. He was a Pharisee with Roman citizenship. He was leading people to kill Christians. He had all the power he could possibly want. I mean, talk about being the top of your food chain. And yet, we see a complete life change in him in all his writings. Also, why would Jews convert and risk their own lives for something that was not true, and also elevated the dirty Gentiles? So one of the words that the Old Testament, that the first century Jews would use to describe Gentiles is kuni. Does anyone know what kuni means? Dogs. Because they're beasts. These are people who had public orgies in the street and on altars, okay? You can imagine why they would call somebody a kuni. Okay, let's just be honest here. You feel like we'd do the same. So why would they go with Gentiles? Like, oh, these crazy folks that we've kind of like kept a distance from because we're trying to keep the holy code, because we're trying to usher in the kingdom of God. Why would they switch? And you guys already know this. If you read, one of the reasons also why I love Peter is that he's so staunch, okay? That man did not want to budge on his beliefs, did he? In fact, that's why you see him and Paul kind of have a little clash, because he's still very Jewish. You have to understand, it would be like asking you to stop believing American values, okay, as Americans. How many of you guys believe in free speech? Right, all of you do, right? You all believe in free speech. Many of you guys would believe in the ability to be free to engage in whatever trade you would like, correct? Okay. Most of you would probably, down with the government, any libertarian? Okay, never mind. No more IRS, just kidding. Okay. So when it comes down to this though, it's like asking us to give up our identity as Americans to convert to Christianity. Isn't it nuts? So think about it. What do they gain? They gain nothing, right? So make no mistake, atheists are not neutral, but they too can present object facts. Could it be that a bias is usually from an object fact that you've studied? Yeah, after I've studied certain things, I'm very biased to my studies, right? Now, the other thing is when usually the people who are saying that they're biased or that you're biased are biased too. So whenever someone says, I'm like, okay, you're biased, I'm biased, who cares? Let's just let the facts speak. Let's talk about that for a minute and then maybe rebuild, okay? Hopefully you can get on my bias. So it is a completely empty gun, if you will. So are the New Testament documents early enough? All New Testament books were written by 100 AD. Remember, Jesus was likely crucified around AD 33. Okay? So this is roughly what we're looking at. Now, different scholars will give you a slightly different date, but I am giving you a fairly, conservative one, somewhere where we can find balance, which are all about 70 years after Jesus' death. That is early in writing, isn't it, in the ancient world, especially in oral culture like the Jews. Because there's this weird, and I know we're in a church that recognizes the difference between Israel and the church, okay? I recognize that. But there's this weird belief that Jews just weren't Christian. Who do you think was following Jesus everywhere? That crowd was Jewish. Gentiles weren't really, because he came first to the Jews, right? The crowd was Jewish. Whether people want to admit, they might be a minority, but they were still Jewish. All right, moving forward. Pet peeve of mine. From 95 to 110 AD, 3 early church fathers quote 25 of the 27 books of the New Testament. Jude and 2 John, those are 2 of them. Ignatius, Polycarp, and Clement were the 3 that did that, by the way. They're the 3 who quoted these books. Clement, he quoted from the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, 1 Timothy, Titus, Hebrews, James 1, and Peter in AD 95. Pretty cool. So, again, those books must, in order to quote something, it probably has to be written. I'm no expert, but I feel like that's a safe bet. All right, Ignatius. He quoted Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 3rd John, and Revelation. I'll tell you one thing that bothers me though, and I'm going to have words with people like Ignatius in heaven. Why do you make me skip over the numbers? Okay? Like 1st and 3rd John. Why not the second one too? But bro, like you're killing me. All right. So then we also have Polycarp. What a name. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Hebrews, 1st Peter, and 1st John. All these books were obviously written before this time. He's only at 110 AD, guys. That's not bad. We're doing pretty good. Again, when people go, these, and I hear this all the time, they were written way after the fact. And they kind of lump it in with like things like the Gospel of Peter and other things that have been rejected by church history throughout. Very strange. And by the way, guys, it's okay to appeal to church history. I feel like some people think that's a Catholic thing. Like, oh, the Roman Catholic Church does that. If that's the case, then the Roman Catholic Church are the only people who have access to the historical claims. Make sense? So we can claim it too. We just disagree with Rome. That's fine. All right. Early church writings. Since Clement was in Rome and Ignatius and Polycarp were hundreds of miles away, the original documents must have been written much earlier right? Because they're all in different locations. So it must have been written before, made plenty of copies to be able to get to them. Make sense? So the latest they could have been written is by 100 AD, but most were probably written before 70 AD, 40 years after Christ's death. Now, if you guys have been paying attention to this class, wait, do I have it up there as a spoiler? Okay, cool. I want to make sure I don't ask a dumb question and you guys are like, it's on the screen. I've mentioned this a few times. What is the big event that took place in 70 AD? Destruction of the temple. Rome destroys the temple and Jerusalem. This would be, okay, if I'm writing American history, okay, because we're Americans, I feel like this is a good way to talk. If I'm writing American history and I'm talking about President Clinton, and then I talk about President Bush and the things that took place in their terms, do you think during that time period, especially under Bush, that there's a particular event that I might make sure I mention? What? 9/11. Because that's a huge moment in our history, right? Something on our turf that we consider to be a representative of our country, something to be proud of, the Twin Towers, destroyed by the enemy forces. That would be recorded. If I don't record this, and I record all the events of Clinton, all these events of Bush, and I didn't date them, do you think you'd be able to break down and go, he must have been writing this before 9/11. He never mentioned it. Makes sense, right? When in any writing in the New Testament is the destruction of the temple mentioned? Never. You can make a claim, and it's a pretty good claim, that Revelation hints to it, okay? But it depends how you view Revelation, okay? Correct. Yep, because it seems like I said, depends how you read it. If you read it as a preterist, they will say that it says that it did happen. Other people will say it prophesied that it would happen in there. Just kind of depends which way you read it. So easy proof of this is the New Testament mentions the temple, but not its destruction in 70 AD. Jesus prophesied this along with his death and resurrection in Mark 13:2 and 30. You guys ever notice that he prophesies the destruction of the temple? Kind of interesting. So this is not an argument from silence, by the way, because this is taking into context when the New Testament was written. People accuse you of that. Well, is this an argument from silence? Well, no, this is how we history, okay? If I can use history as a verb. Like, this is how we do it. This is how we figure it out. So Rome destroyed the temple, and Josephus called it the greatest war of all time. So this war left everything destroyed, their home country and capital. It was worse than Pearl Harbor or even 9/11, so it probably would have been recorded pretty clearly, right? Because you have to remember, it wasn't just the destruction of the temple, it was a ransack of Jerusalem. All holy things destroyed. There's actually some really graphic descriptions of what was taking place. I'll leave that to your imagination. You know world history enough to know how bad things can get. So, we're going to move forward a little bit here. So early writings, a few things. Paul was killed by Nero, whose reign ended by 68 AD. So if he was killed, we have a lot of his writings, surprise, we have a lot of his writings. If Paul was killed by Nero, whose reign ended by 68 AD, we can make a deduction that Paul must have written these before he died. So James was killed by the Sanhedrin in AD 62. Luke's writings are meticulously detailed with over 84 historically confirmed details. He details the death of two martyrs, both James and Stephen, right? Remember that whole sermon by Stephen, and then at the end they're like, well, instead of listening, we're just going to stone him. Seems like a civil response. So we can conclude that it was before AD 62. So, the book of Mark was written then. Now we shall move forward. All right. The book of Mark was written before Luke. By the way, Mark is most likely the earliest of all the Gospels. Have you guys ever noticed that Mark is the shortest as well? It's kind of, I would like you to do this sometime, just in your own studies. Read Mark, and then read Matthew, and then read Luke, and tell me if you don't see the difference. You'll notice that Matthew is very Jewish, like extremely Jewish. So Jewish that you might even be like, oh my goodness, I need to start sacrificing things and eat kosher. Yep, the kingdom of God, because that's actually what Jesus was pushing, which goes into the atonement that we will discuss in a couple weeks. So since Mark was an eyewitness, that must mean that we have a written testimony within about 25 to 30 years of Jesus Christ. So this is far too early to be a legendary account. It also means the eyewitness testimony was far earlier. I want to kind of emphasize this because legend is one of the things that are brought up. If you talk to skeptical scholars, they'll say that the risen Christ is a legend, right? Something like an urban legend. What is that one bird that's an urban legend down like New Jersey? Does anyone have the image in my mind? Whatever, never mind. But usually it takes generations for urban legends to build, right? This is not generations, this is pretty soon, so we can't say it was a legend. And remember, we're taking this as a historical approach. Of course, I'm a theologian and a pastor, blah, 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 but I just want to make sure we're being clear. Paul, as a witness, gives the testimony that he received from Christ, and Jerusalem was the place of fake, so Jerusalem was the last place a fake resurrection could have taken place. The Jews and Romans wanted to crush Christianity. They could have easily paraded the body through the streets, couldn't they? I mean, you're in Jerusalem. You're like in Jewish capital. If they really wanted to, they would have found it. This is why many of the claims of the Jews was what? They took the body and they hid it and claimed that he rose from the dead. Right? Of course, then that raises other problems, which we will discuss. Paul cites 14 eyewitnesses, then references some about 500 witnesses, and including one skeptic who was James and one enemy, which was Paul himself. People don't like that. That's inconvenient. That's very inconvenient. Paul was like, I was an enemy of it, but I had a confrontation on my road to Damascus, right? Acts chapter 9. And we have good reason to believe that this is all true from Paul. So then we look at James. Did you all know that James was a skeptic of Jesus? You'll notice that Jesus actually was not popular in his family. If you read about his family kind of thought he was crazy. So the fact that James converts and others do shows something, okay? So the earliest writings, which are about in the AD 50s or earlier, we have Galatians, probably around AD 48, 1 Thessalonians 50 to 54, and Romans between AD 57 through 58. So we know that all these documents from the New Testament documents are certainly early enough. I know I'm being pedantic here, but I really want to just nail this into your head. If you can only remember a couple facts at the end of this to talk to people about, that's cool, but I want you guys to at least go, I don't remember everything, but I definitely remember we have really good reason, and I'll have to get back into it, right? At least I'm giving you like a roadmap in your brain that you can hopefully trace back later. So historical research indicates that a myth cannot begin to grow while eyewitnesses are still alive. Really hard to build a myth when people can go, dude, that's not what happened, bro. I was there, right? We've all done that when the guy that you grew up with tries telling crazy stories about things, and you're like, bro, I was there. That's not what happened. All right. So the culture, also, another thing to remember in the first century, the culture was illiterate. I think it was like less than 10% could write. The culture was illiterate and primarily an oral culture. Once years passed and they realized that Christ had not come back yet, they likely saw fit to record these events for future generations. Because they thought, I mean, you read Paul. He was like, this is happening, bro, tomorrow. Like, it was very urgent, Christ's return. There's easy evidence for this, by the way. Gary Habermas points out that there are 41 parts of the New Testament designed as creeds to be easily repeated. This is found in, like Paul, where he's like, and on the third day, he rose again according to the scriptures. That whole part there was quoted always as a creed, probably by early church gatherings. Like they'd get together, they'd quote the creed. So when you're looking at this, there's about 41 parts of that. That's probably because they were an oral culture. It's easy to remember when you create it in an easily repeated way, and they're recording it for future generations. So as Christianity spread, then writings became even more practical, right? Paul can't travel everywhere. Someone's got to carry the news. Someone's got to carry the instructions. So follow what Paul says, and we're just going to write it all down. So the next question is, why not more documents? That's always my next favorite question, because you're like, what more do you want? But anyway, remember, we have more than anything else in the ancient world. First thing first, we have more, and not by a little. You guys remember that chart last week? Not by a little, by a long shot, like by miles. It's like, you know in NASCAR when somebody gets lapped? This was like lapped times like 20, okay? Like the person just got crushed. All right, so Jesus is referenced by more authors than even the emperor of his time. We have 49, including Jesus, including the disciples and Christians and non-Christians. We have 49 total for Jesus and 10 for Tiberius Caesar. 9 of these authors were eyewitnesses or contemporaries. All mention or suggest a resurrection. This is more than enough to establish historicity, by the way, for us to go, yeah, okay, all right. So the entire New Testament can be reconstructed except for 11 verses from historical writings. Let that sink in, guys. The entire New Testament can be reconstructed. That's using early church fathers and those types of documents. We could reconstruct the entire New Testament. It's intense. So that's what's funny when people are like, oh, how do we know? Like the king, Micah. I don't know. I don't have that written in my notes. You want me to just be able to quote off 11 verses like that, bruh? I compile them. I said cursory view. I can try to find out what those are for you, okay? I can try to find out. I'm sure I have them written down somewhere at home. I'm just trying to give you the... I know, I will say that's on me. Because what I have done this entire time is always made the claim and gave a list, right? I will give you that score 1 from Micah, but I'm still a score like 20,000 with this whole presentation, so shut up. Do you know how long these took to put together, and you want to get that nitpicky with me? Somebody throw him a chair. You can imagine when he lived with us, the amount of yelling that took place. Anyway. What? Yes, that's true. You're distracting me, but it's because you and Julius argue like an old married couple. And I'm louder, so okay, all right. So the entire New Testament can be reconstructed, except for 11 verses, which I will try to find for you. You have to remind me, though. I will forget. So with all that being said, on this aspect of do we have early testimony, early witness, and do we have eyewitness testimony? We've explored this the last, 4 or 5 weeks? Has that been helpful? Do you realize how much more that has your faith just deepened just with this? Because I hope it has. This helped me a lot. Martin Luther King Jr. put it very well, actually, and I know he wasn't a perfectly moral man, right? But he did have faith in Christ, even though he wasn't perfect. But he said this: evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy a palace and Christ a cross, but one day that same Christ will rise up and split history into AD and BC so that even the life of Caesar must be dated by his name. Boom. So in the end, I think we can say for a fact that we have good historical reasons. A few things. Next week, I will be going over the core case of the resurrection. I encourage you to bring your friends. Invite people, even the people who are like out there who don't normally come, like, dude, you're going to want to stay because it's Palm Sunday. You should want to talk about the resurrection of Jesus because you're a Christian. Boom, guilt trip. All right. And then the other thing I wanted to make sure that you guys know is that the next thing I'm going to do is the top reasons we know. So I'm just going to go through the top reasons we know that Christianity is true. And then we're going to go over fulfilled prophecy. Okay? Those are the next things on the list. Now, I think after we do the resurrection case and the top 10 reasons we know, I might pause and do a little bit of a series on the atonement, what Christ's death actually accomplished and how that probably all worked. Recently, I've been called a heretic because of my view. It's not. My case actually comes from the earliest church fathers. But anyway, I will walk you through it. It'll be a good time. And then you can call me a heretic afterward. It'll be fun. The blood of Christ covers our sin, and that's the story, right? So anyway, with that being said, I hope your faith is deepened through all this. I know this has been a very long series, and I'm just going to keep going through stuff. Just things that I dig through. I want you guys to understand that I never went through a crisis of faith necessarily where I questioned God's existence and almost went atheist. But I will say there was a period of time that I went, but I don't know if we can know. I believe, but I don't know if we can. And that's caused me to dig, especially because I started getting hard questions by teenagers in the youth group that I was working with, and I realized I did not have good answers for them. And as a guy, as I'm sure you guys have known me well enough and heard me long enough, I like to know things. I don't like to be caught with my pants down, so to speak. Very embarrassing. And so I started to dig, and the more I dug, the more my strength, my faith deepened. Also, the more my narrow little brain widened as to how broad Christianity truly is. And because I think in our little tribal world today, it's always us versus them. In most of the dispensational churches I've been in, it's always us versus the covenant theologians, or if you're in my little world, it's like the free willers versus the non-free willers, or et cetera, et cetera. But the kingdom is much broader. Let's not pigeonhole it, but I think as you go through this, you can start going, that's what makes someone a Christian. Whoever believes on the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ and his saving work for us. I'm preaching now. But I think that when we go, that's what makes someone a Christian, and I'm okay with that. I don't need to always be at war. Now, granted, that's coming from a guy who does like war a little bit, but on some of these things. I do like to get into it, guys. I like to get into it, but it's never in an effort to divide Christians, but more to challenge and grow as a people. So, questions, comments, or insults? Nothing? I'm a really good teacher, I think, because I never get questions. Or y'all are sleeping. Okay. With that being said, you guys are dismissed. Thank you so much for always attending.